Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Jamsty Podcast Record Club, where each week one of us picks a record for everyone to review, and then we review it. And sometimes more than one record, and sometimes more than two people. But, we make do here on the podcast. This week is my record club, one I have been waiting for a while, just because this year I kind of got a little bit more ambitious with some of my picks for record clubs, just because I wanted to move away maybe from things that were like important to me or that I considered underrated or that like my friends hadn't heard, and wanted to go in a more discussion oriented route. We did a 2 album record club earlier in the year where we talked about the Beatles Revolver and Beach Boys Pet Sounds, which was a fun little discussion. And today we have another dual discussion for me, except this isn't comparing 2 albums from a different artist. In fact, it's 2 albums from the same artist under different names. We're going to be talking for the first time about both of these respective bands on this podcast. We're going to be talking about Gorillaz' album Plastic Beach and the Blur album 13, both, of course, spearheaded by Britpop legend Damon Albarn. And the reason I wanted to cover these albums is, I mean, it's a bit more multifaceted than just sort of comparing 2 beloved records from 2 beloved bands that happen to be under the umbrella of the same artist. And that I do think it would be interesting to talk about them and compare them in a sense of being like, these are 2 very different projects. So it's inherently just kind of interesting to see how multifaceted a given artist is. But I think that in terms of these records' reputation, in recent years especially, they have come to be the most beloved records in their respective bands' catalogs. I know that can certainly be disputed by some people, as these bands have many records like Demon Days or Park Life or the self-titled for both of them that a lot of people really love. But I think generally speaking, Plastic Beach and Blur's 13 are 2 albums that came out and were very critically well received, but also I think maybe took fans a while to get on board with, due to them being a kind of not really experimental release, but a departure from what came before it in some respects, so that now they're considered part of the great artistic canon, but maybe took a little while to get there. Albums that the Marty McFly meme, the fucking your kids are gonna love it.
Yeah, the way I think of it, and the way I like the idea of discussing these 2 records together is, yeah, they're like the critical darling albums from these respective bands, but they're also like Blur and Gorillaz are kind of self-consciously irreverent projects. Like there's a tongue-in-cheek nature to both of those bands in general. The way they poke fun, or the way that Blur, for instance, poke fun at certain aspects of, Southern English middle-class society. The way that Gorillaz kind of foregrounded this ambitious conceptual idea of the virtual band and essentially created these sort of massive landscapes of digital detritus and would have for every like surprisingly emotional moment 3 or 4 moments of just pure goofing around, essentially. A band that's easy to listen to if you don't want music that takes itself too seriously. But what's interesting about these 2 records is that they both represent a darker pivot for each band. So 13 is Blur's breakup album. Not only is it very explicitly about the end of the relationship between Damon Albarn and Elastica frontwoman Justine Frischman, Plastic Beach is this record that has a lot of the familiar sonic signifiers of previous Gorillaz records and the same sense of kind of fun and goofiness kind of dotted throughout it. But its overarching theme is one of like climate decay and essentially the digital detritus of a world that's essentially so saturated by bright colored media and all these sorts of meaningless pieces of stimulation. So both bands, I think, are conceptual bands. Blur have always had an ear for the conceptual, and so have Gorillaz, obviously. Within their albums as well, they're both album bands that think very much about music in terms of how all of the songs pieced together into the album format, although admittedly Gorillaz have kind of moved a little bit away from that in recent years as to being more of a like songs-based band. But nevertheless, these are both records that I think take a great deal of care to how they approach the album format and how they construct and piece together these songs such that you get a real arc of a progression through the record. And also such that basically every song on both records is elevated from its individual status by its presence and place in its respective record. So yeah, we have two records that represent generally light-hearted bands getting a little bit more serious, a little bit darker, a little bit more conceptual, a little bit more appealing to the critics as well, like kind of providing critical fodder that got them a lot of that acclaim, but also moved a little bit away from some of the more punchy, in-your-face stuff that got them on the radio. And so we're going to talk about these records one at a time. Obviously, we'll start with the Blur record first, which came out in 1999. And I think we'll make no bones about this as well. Like, I actually don't know exactly where you come down, Jake, but for the case of both records we're talking about today, we're talking about my favorite albums from each of these respective bands, or at least what I feel to be the creative peak of each of those respective bands. There's definitely a case to be made for alternatives, as you said before, Jake. But 13 for me, while it may not be the epitome of what made Blur a staple of Britpop and what you kind of think of when you think about Blur, in fact, in many ways, it self-consciously shirks basically all of those attributes. It is, I think, the peak not only of Damon Albarn's songwriting, but also of the band's cohesion and sense of musical adventurousness and a clear idea of what they are. Because as much as I love a lot of Blur records, Parklife is a great album, definitely their most significant record. The Great Escape is really, really good too. Think Tank, the record they made after this, I think it's all over the place, but it's also really, really underrated, I think. But the thing with a lot of Blur records is that for as significant as they can be culturally, for as amazing as their big singles can be, a lot of those albums don't hang together super well holistically, or at the very least, while there is care taken to how they might sound as an album, they're either too long or too full of digressions or spread themselves too thin at certain points. Whereas 13, I think, is the most clear-headed vision of a singular cohesive work that Blur put together. And I think it's also emblematic of the continued prominence of Blur's guitarist Graham Coxon as a songwriter and as a musical force within the band. He's obviously always been really, really important, but I feel like here is where not only does he come to the fore, which you've got a little bit more of him on the self-titled record that preceded this, but he, I think, has more of a role in the musical direction of this album. It is a more guitar-focused record. It's a record that feels more born out of the grunge era than out of the shiny, happy Britpop era of the UK. And it is a showcase for some of his most adventurous and exciting playing that is really well attuned to this mode that Damon Albarn is writing in, this incredibly heartbroken mode. And I mean, the record starts with what I think is one of Blur's most enduring singles, one of my favorite love songs of the 90s, very much in the tradition of the kind of longing blues influenced British rock love song that you got on a record like Spiritualized. Ladies and gentlemen, we're floating
I
in
was
space.
gonna make the same fucking. I was thinking it listening to this last night. I was, this sounds like the fucking opener from Ladies and Gentlemen, We're Floating in Space. It's the same thing.
Yeah, it has the massive sort of choir that comes in. It's a
Yep.
very simple song, musically simple melody, but they find a way to make it feel huger and huger as the song goes on. And actually, weirdly enough, it very much has that vibe of Spiritualized around this time, but it also feels like it's kind of a more successful execution of some of the really big anthemic reaching rock songs that Oasis tried to do on Be Here Now, for instance,
Yeah,
just more
had that
tastefully
thought too.
executed here. I love this song so much. This is, for the record, this is an album that I've loved ever since I was a teenager. Songs like Tender and songs like Caramel and songs like No Distance Left to Run have been literally have been on mixtapes that I've made for girlfriends. Like, it's a record that and it's also a record that's been there for me when those relationships have inevitably ended as well.
Giving
So,
giving a girlfriend a playlist or a mixtape with No Distance Left to Run on it is like you might as well be handing them a noose.
okay, yeah, maybe that one might not have been on the lovey-dovey mixtape as much, but it was definitely like, this was a record that I definitely associate with like a particular person that I was with for a particular period of time. We both really, really loved Blur, and we both thought this was their best album, and emotions and stuff. But yeah, Tender is like one of the most enduring Blur singles. I think it is so well positioned to open this record. It's the kind of song that I could understand kind of calling it a bit indulgent and overlong, but I love the song goes on for as long as it does. I am just continually with it the whole time. And I feel like Damon Albarn finds a soulfulness here that he finds on a number of places on this record that really suits him, I think. One of the things that I'm going to get to a bit later on is the limitations of Damon Albarn as a vocalist and how he sometimes manages to work around these, and sometimes how they can limit the total greatness of the music. But I think for the most part on 13, he's really able to slide into this particular, really heartfelt mode super well. And I find his singing really, really compelling on this record and this opening track in particular.
It's funny that you mention that these are your two favorite records from their respective bands, because we, at least with between the two of us, managed to get the maximum contrast and perspective, because I have very, very minimal history with both of these bands. I hadn't heard up until this week, had not heard an entire record front to back from either of these bands. I've heard songs from the self-titled Blur, songs from Park Life, never the full album. I've heard songs from the self-titled Gorillaz, heard songs from Demon Days, never either of those albums. It was just that all of them were kind of like, when I listened to Blur or Gorillaz, it was done so in a moment of like musical frivolity, where I was just kind of looking for something to listen to, and it just didn't like catch my interest in the way that you want suddenly, like you just want something a little bit more immediate, I guess. And so I just kind of switched and put them off until later, and was gonna like sit down and really just kind of take it all in with these. And with Blur, I was expecting this to be the sort of like the straight man to the Gorillaz like comedic side character, to be a very like of the Britpop scene, to be very like, I always was under the impression, like, coincidentally, I was also listening to Stephen Hyden's podcast about band rivalries, and I listened to the Damon Albarn and Oasis one, and I got the impression that while they were bands that were in the same movement, that Oasis was way more classically rock oriented, and that Blur was a little bit more like, I don't want to say sophisticated, because that inherently means that that's like better, but in a sense that it's like Oasis just kind of appeals to the sort of lizard brain rock and roll side of you, and Blur appeals to the little bit more like, fucking college educated, I like indie rock kind of shit. And so listening to 13 was wild for me, because it was not at all what I thought it was going to be. Like, not even a little bit, a million miles away from it, in fact. And the thing I like the most about it is that I would honestly say that it feels almost like, I don't think that this was a conscious choice on Damon Albarn's part necessarily, though I don't want to like rule that out to discount his artistic credibility here. 13 feels almost like a deconstruction of the concept of the breakup album. And I feel like you see that as early as Tender, which feels like from the get-go, you sort of get the idea that Damon Albarn, the main character of this album, whoever you want to label it as, like this is a song that very blanketly to me reads as a sort of denial or coping mechanism, sort of using this kind of big stadium rock spiritualized sound to kind of like it the song is like about someone trying to forget about all of their other problems and sort of take solace in love. And it's like even the lyrics, it's like of someone that you love too much, you know, talking about screwing up his life, someone who could heal his mind. It's someone who wants to be in a relationship because he thinks being in a relationship will improve him as a person, and not because he is genuinely like feeling something for someone else. It feels kind of dishonest to that. And
Mm-hmm.
this sort of feels like the most cogent song on this record for that purpose. And basically throughout the whole record, you basically see this album deteriorate in real time. It becomes
Yes.
noisier and fuzzier, and like there are just sections of songs that just end and begin, and like they're totally fucking different songs. Like the final third and first third of some songs on this album sound completely fucking different. Sometimes they don't even have lyrics. And I think that all of these things that made this so unfriendly upon release are what I really love about it. Like, I did not expect to get on with an album so conceptually odd, so lyrically sparse, and so like antithetical to what I find captivating about most breakup albums. But my God, it really feels like that at this point, you almost feel as if this album is indicative of where Albarn would go creatively with a band like Gorillaz, because it feels like he's pushing at the boundaries of Blur's sound here. It feels like he can't be contained. He just needs to be more adventurous. He needs to be more idiosyncratic. And as a result, you get this wildly ambitious, weird little album that I just like. All of the song links on this supremely put me off from listening to it before this week, just because it's like you see 7 minutes, it's an hour long and it's 13 minutes, and it's got like one song on here that's like 2 minutes long. It's like 7 minutes, 6 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, and you're just kind of like, okay, I'm getting some Be Here Now vibes, I'm not gonna lie. And like, you know, but I agree, it really works for this album. God damn.
Yeah, I like what your observation about Tender as well, about the fact that it's kind of a song that's rife with hypocrisy and just poor approaches to romanticism in general. Like on and you're right, because like Blur have kind of always been, as I sort of said before, Blur have kind of always been this band that their whole shtick has kind of been sort of subverting or even undermining certain established tropes in the musical world that they work around, or in the musical world that they come out of, and the music that they love as well. Like it's the undermining of certain musical tropes is done with affection, but at the same time, like this is a record that has like, that is a song that has like the most overwrought sentiments running through it, like the whole like love's the greatest thing. The way he sings that as well is like so like just portentous and just,
Ingenuous.
yeah, exactly. Like the and just the whole refrain of, oh my baby.
It's
Oh
it's
what?
like an Albarn sat down to make, like, he was just like, okay, I've experienced heartbreak. I'm going to make a breakup album. And as he did so, he kind of like became almost disinterested with it because the concept didn't gel with him. And so he just made it like immediately after this song you get Bugman, which has guitars on it that sound like a bajillion miles away from guitar. This is like Pinkerton, Weezer, pathways of distortion that just barely, like, it sounds like it's on fire. You can barely hear anything else in it. And this also just, oh, it's a fucking banger, which there's not a lot of on here, but still the guitar melodies on here are a little bit cogent. It like combines a sort of acoustic sound with this just like overwhelmingly fuzzy, fat fucking just like and it just, it really goes. It's I was very like happy to see that this
Yeah.
album, for as deconstructive and as adventurous as it becomes, still appeals to that kind of primal rock and roll sensibilities in me in respective parts, at least.
Yeah, so it's worth mentioning that this record was produced by William Orbit, who's like an English electronic artist, ambient musician, trip hop musician. He's kind of like he was a really prolific,
that makes sense.
really prolific figure in the 90s in terms of production. He also produced Madonna's album Ray of Light as well around the same time as this. And his sensibilities are super well attuned to what Blur are doing on this record. And yeah, you do get that sense of whiplash from Tender into Bugman. I mean, Bugman just genuinely being the most abrasive and just fucking gnarly thing that Blur or that Albarn has ever produced in any project. I mean, it's like so abrasive and sort of uncomfortably produced that it's almost like difficult to even listen to. You really have to get onto that wavelength, especially when you're set up for it by a song like Tender. And but it's a showcase for Graham Coxon as well, who is absolutely just completely going off the deep end in terms of exploring effects and tone and all of the different things that he can do with his guitar. Which brings me to what is, in my opinion, the opinion of a lot of people, the greatest Blur song, Coffee and TV, which is written and sung by Graham Coxon exclusively. And this is like one of the most iconic Blur songs. It has this very unforgettable music video about with this anthropomorphic milk carton that goes on all these sorts of adventures. And it's an incredibly sad song. It's a song essentially about being numb and kind of relinquishing yourself to the meaningless and simple comforts of a very predictable and idle routine. And it's heartbreaking to listen to. It's yeah, as a teenager, I think I almost underappreciated this song because it's got such a it's so embedded in like the realities of like being grown up and just the quiet devastation and like the ultimate boredom of being depressed that I don't think I quite understood then as much as I do now. Like it's a very understated song. The melodies are gorgeous and really lovely and catchy, but they're understated and underplayed. Coxon's guitar work, there's this layer of fuzz on it that's subtle, but also just enough to kind of just slightly bury the melodies themselves a little bit. But Coxon himself comes through with his beautiful vocal performance. He has these lovely melodies, and again, the lyricism is just second to none. This is a song that I feel like every year I get older and inevitably come back to this record. This song hits me more and more as a true kind of pinnacle of songwriting in this era. It's just it's really like one of my favorite songs that's ever been written about like being depressed and just continuing to live your life essentially and work your way through the routine. It's a song that really connects with me on a super deep level and does with a lot of other people too. So yeah, already within this first 3-song stretch, you're given an absolute whirlwind in terms of varied sonic interests and thematic pursuits for Blur. You have 3 distinct personalities expressed on these first 3 songs. The kind of wry, self-indulgent portrait of a bleeding heart songwriter on Tender. You have this kind of ultimately revolting sort of self-loathing caustic violence of Bugman, and then you just have both of those facades kind of falling away into this ultimately broken human being who has to confront the fact that they're powerless with Coffee and TV. And that dynamic within those first 3 songs is kind of like the progression of the album as a whole, really, as well, is that it starts with these songs that are broadly a little more caustic, a little more tongue-in-cheek, a little like less direct, and then eventually as the record goes on, the layers of the layers of sarcasm, the layers of satire essentially just get peeled away until the broken person at the core of it is revealed. Like, your classic moments of Blur kind of tongue-in-cheek satire include songs like Swamp Song, which is this deliberately sort of ridiculous, almost parody of big tent rock anthem songs, where it has like this big sort of riff that you would associate with like, this massive rock and roll sound, and yet it's produced to sound murky and buried. And it's just, if you try to like play it on a stereo, it sounds like there's something wrong with your system. It's just produced
Borderline atonal almost. They're like the guitar in this, every time the acoustic guitar is strummed in this, it sounds like they tuned it wrong purposefully. You're just kind of like,
yeah, and like Damon is just like the most sort of meaningless lyrics ever written. Like, give me good times, give me soul life, give me fever, I'm a believer. Like, it's just such a dead-eyed song. And like, I could understand for some people it being like a bit indulgent, or just feeling a little bit like, okay, I get it. It's very like attuned to the sensibilities of like some of the most indulgent moments of a band like Radiohead, where Tom York would very much do this sort of laying it on thick.
This album as a whole is very post OK Computer, post the Bends, like fucking specifically Coffee and TV makes me think of Fake Plastic Trees kind of stuff. And I feel like that might be like, at least sonically speaking, I feel like OK Computer actually might have been a bit of an influence on some places on the record, just because it does kind of feel like the sort of sonic ambition, sort of like shoot for the stars, pulling from like all these kinds of different things. Maybe that made like, I would imagine that encouraged a lot of bands who came out of Radiohead scene to maybe kind of let loose and sort of unfurl their artistic sensibilities a little bit. So it like makes an album like 13 feel almost like it was a result of a sort of collective exhale, maybe, that lots of other bands who maybe wanted to do stuff that was a little less commercial, that was a bit farther away from what was really popular, like grunge or something, and they were just like, oh, but we have to do stuff that makes us commercially viable, and we have to stick to our like Britpoppy shit. But now that's not necessarily the case, so it paves the way for this fucking mess.
It's like one of the overriding characteristics of this record is that like it feels so self-conscious about itself that it deliberately obfuscates what other artists would just do very straightforwardly and clearly, up to a point until it stops doing that. But we'll get to that later in the back half of the record, because like the first half of the record is like, super heartfelt song followed by just complete mania, like this completely just stupid song that follows it, that almost it seems like it's trying to undercut any genuine pathos the album has.
That sort of that sequencing in Ladies and Gentlemen, where they do, big song, stately song, big song, that kind of like revolving door structure.
Yeah, exactly. Because you like Bugman follows Tender and just completely just fucks up that sense of emotional flow and tangibility, and then Swamp Song follows Coffee and TV and does the same sort of thing. And then you get like, it's like the odd numbered tracks on the first half of this record are like masterpieces to me, and then the even numbered tracks are like they're deliberately trying to make you regret listening to this record in ways that I've been able to really like get on board with. But to continue my talk about, like, this record has a number of like not only my favorite Blur songs, but like I think some of my favorite songs I've ever heard. And another one of those is 1992, the fifth song on this record, which is, I think, the darkest song on this album. Which is saying something, considering that we've also got No Distance Left to Run, which is a song that I'll get to, but ultimately kind of makes peace with the sadness. But anyway, 1992 is just harrowing. Like, it's lyrically fairly minimal. It's kind of spiteful and bitter. It sort of speaks towards this feeling of betrayal at the end of this relationship. But sonically, it is like an utterly just horrific. Like it starts with, again, this very sort of like effects laden, distorted acoustic guitar sound that is kind of like feels like it's being played underneath a sheet, and you can just kind of hear that sound muffled just a little bit. And then as the song goes on, you just get this like just horrible whining dissonant feedback sound that just kind of eases into the song like a shepherd tone that you can like actually hear, and eventually just completely swallows it whole. It's like legitimately harrowing.
Yeah, this was the moment where I heard this song on the album and I was like, all right, I'm gonna love this. And listener, I did. It's almost like right at the halfway point is where this just like, it's not even that it like just becomes like this distorted scuzzy mess, which it does, but it becomes it in a way that like it makes you feel like it's like a new song has begun. Like the melody, like it's like not only is it kind of stripped away, but it's just completely fucking different from the first part of the song. It's like right after he has the lyric, you took it all instead, and then it just sort of feels like that line just feels really gutting, like you're just listening to these like disconnected phrases which sort of like implies that he's like talking to someone with like a connection with, and then you just feel that connection sonically sever right at the halfway point. And then it just goes into, honestly, this might be my like favorite stretch on the record here. 1992, Blue REMI and Battle are just like three fucking, I mean, they're incredible songs, but I also almost hesitate to call them songs because they don't feel, they feel like you're like listening to channeled melancholy. It feels like you're just kind of like, should I be listening to this?
Yeah, I
don't know.
think I think BLUREMI, which I don't really like all that much, but I will still like
Really love it, honestly.
I won't skip it or anything, but it's like the most egregious example of like this record like deliberately trying to pull the rug from under you in terms of like you having settled into a certain tone. And by this point, you've accepted your fate, right? You get that this record is bipolar, essentially. Like it is manic every moment that it's not depressive. And Battle, the kind of centerpiece of this record, is a great song. Like this is one of the most deconstructed songs musically here. It's kind of almost ambient in a lot of places, but just occasionally you'll get that anchoring of the drums and this very, again, avant-garde phrasing and playing from Coxon on the guitar. Like there's just parts of this where he's just using feedback, like towards the end of the song where he just kind of like hits these incredibly harsh tones and just kind of lets them ring out in distortion. And it's like, this isn't music. You're just making noise.
It's so sinister sounding too. There's like every bit of production in this makes this like, this is the most OK Computerish song on here. It's just sort of feels like it's smothering you in nothing but like, it feels like the ghost of a rock song. It feels like something that was once something else and then decayed. And I think that's actually it's there's no better place where I think that principle is echoed than on one of my favorite songs on here, almost my favorite, which is funny just because again it almost goes to the territory of like, this doesn't feel like a song, but it is. And that's Trailer Park, which once you told me that this was produced by a trip hop producer, I was just like, well, that makes Trailer Park make a whole lot of sense because Trailer Park is a fucking trip hop song. It is literally just a fucking, it is a song that is like, right, like this reminds me of like Wandering Star off of the Portishead debut, except with like, if they took the instrumental and Wandering Star and just fucking just distorted the shit out of it. It just makes it like audibly illegible.
Yeah,
this is like, just such an upsetting fucking song.
This is the point in the record where like, you know, they're really like not trying to even pretend that they're doing anything relatively straightforward anymore. Trailer Park is actually like interesting because when I was a teenager, I didn't like the song at all. I just thought, what is this? This is fucking stupid. And again, the older I've gotten, the more I've just been like, actually, this is kind of sick. And like, it's so like, because it's just like the principal like music, every basic musical idea in this song is atonal and detuned and just kind of like just squashed up. But it's also like kind of loungy and weirdly just kind of jazzy in a certain way as well. It's a strange song, and that
Yeah.
strangeness and uniqueness for it that it has kind of only endeared me to it more and more over time. And it also sort of clears the palette for, again, like I've already talked about three of my favorite songs ever, and yet we still haven't gotten to my actual favorite stretch of the record, which is the 3 song run
Caramel.
of Caramel, Trim Trab, and No Distance Left to Run, which
Yeah.
this is like, and what I appreciate about this is because so far you've had this just belligerent structure to this record where it kind of just goes veering from one extreme to the other. And this is the point in the record where it really kind of just doesn't, it kind of gives up the ghost essentially and just kind of submerges you into just pure blackness with none of the humor. Or like Trailer Park is really the last moment on the record where you get a sense of irreverence coming through, and the rest of it is just pure gloom and despair. Like Caramel, which when I was a teenager was my favorite song on this record, is just pure fucking heartbreak and sheer fucking self-indulgent depression, the kind of shit that you just wallow in when you're in the wake of a breakup, or even just when you're just having a really shitty time of it. Like, this is a song where the guitar tones, everything about this little wee snatches of just distorted ringing that Coxon does on his guitar just absolutely cut my heart into pieces. And Albarn is kind of like not even really trying to sing that much. He's just kind of like uttering these like reassurances to himself that are just obviously hollow. I've got to stop smoking, I've got to get better, I've got to start, and there's no conviction in it whatsoever. And then to the end of the song where he just kind of like starts wailing. And it's so intense of an experience, and yet it's intense while having this incredibly atmospheric soundscape to it. Like, it's not claustrophobic to listen to like certain other moments in the record are. It's kind of just like you're falling while you listen to it. It's an amazing musical construction. I love this song so much still.
It also kind of adds to my sort of like the deconstructive qualities of the album, because what the song is like, it is mostly like disconnected phrases and whatnot, but I still read the lyrics here as this song being like, and when you're an artist or a creative in the wake of heartbreak or depression or all that, like you're stewing in yourself, but you also want to use that to like fuel you. And like he's got lyrics like this of like, oh, I've got to find genius. It's like he's talking about himself making this album, where he's like in the pursuit of trying to find meaning out of this, and you're listening to him fail to do that just because the song is such a like, it doesn't ever like ignite. It just kind of fuzzily smothers you. And that's why it's so fucking emotionally effective. Like, my God. Fuck. Yes. Completely co-sign.
And then we get the song Trim Trab, which I've always had a huge affection for. And what's really special about this song to me is that it's kind of like, it's the same sort of song and spirit that Blur wrote on a lot of their earlier records, where it's like kind of a piss take of a particular like aspect of vacuous British culture, this kind of like mindless sort of pub drinking listlessness, essentially, that Albarn, for the record, to be clear, never pretends he's really above in any way. He always kind of takes the piss out of himself, as much as, there's certain like archetypes of British culture and society. But the thing about this song is that while it's a continuation of that sort of, that kind of jab that they've done, that A-Bone has written before, the sense of humor that those songs have is kind of just not here at all. This is just purely like, I am a piece of shit. Everyone else around me is a piece of shit and I am no better than them. And that is just the way that it is indefinitely. Like it speaks again to another aspect of that depressive experience. There's like elements of drug abuse that I feel like are evoked very subtly in this song and throughout the record as well. Again, and it just sort of like, it has this sort of like almost sprightly little acoustic guitar melody that I absolutely love. And it kind of like, it just kind of iterates it and repeats it in the same way that Albarn is repeating these very depressive lyrics about, life being unchangeable and just permanently fucking stuck in a sense of stasis. And then at the end of the song, it just completely erupts and just breaks down entirely, like a lot of songs do, but in a way that feels like just even more noisy and chaotic than maybe any other previous moment on the record. The way he's just like, his vocals are so distorted and he's just kind of going, it's just the way it is, while Coxon is literally like just scraping his strings and almost trying to break them deliberately, doing this riff and just sending it into the depths of hell. And you have these like little electronic harp sounds at certain points in the song as well. They're almost like mocking the rest of the music. It's such a fucking like classic Blur song to me. I love, I love the spirit of the song, and I love the style of the song. It actually feels like it evolves out of a lot of the harder edge stuff that they were doing on their self-titled record. And then it just falls away into No Distance Left to Run, which is the perfect way to kind of end this record, essentially, because it strips away all of the denial. It strips away all of the, well, not all of the self-pity. There's definitely still some self-pity in it, but it strips away a lot of the facade and a lot of the artifice and a lot of the pointless venom, and just says like, I hope you're with someone who makes you feel safe and you're sleeping tonight. I won't kill myself trying to stay in your life. It is, it's a sad song, and it is not exactly a song about, like, it's a song about moving on, but it's not necessarily a song that has a happy ending either. It just kind of acknowledges the kind of cold reality of what is necessary, what you kind of have to do when you've kind of gone through all these grieving stages in the wake of the end of something really emotionally significant to you. And it's just forthright about the fact that, it doesn't mean the end of your misery. It just means, to a certain extent, that you can stop lashing out about it, and you can at least find some semblance of peace. And it's, I mentioned it as an honorable mention in our greatest breakup songs video, which went up the other week. Go and check that out if you haven't seen it. And it is one of the greatest breakup songs, I think, because it is about, there's so many great breakup songs that are about, that venomous feeling of like utter despair. And this is a song that validates that feeling, but also acknowledges the importance of moving on from it. So it's just a perfect song.
I couldn't have said it any better myself. It's the best thing here for my money, just purely because you kind of feel like it is definitely like it's more similar to some of the songs on the front half, and that you sort of feel it's more songfulness. But it feels like, your head's been submerged this whole time. This kind of feels like coming up for air, but also it doesn't really like relent on the emotional assault at all. It just kind of gives you a clearer perspective on what's happening, I guess. So it just feels like it hits hard, and it hits hard at the exact point in the album at which it could hit hardest.
Yeah, exactly. And that is Blur's 13. That is one of the most harrowing and unusual breakup albums. And Jake, you said it yourself, like it's a successful breakup album despite doing so many things that are completely uncharacteristic of the kind of breakup albums that we are attracted to, generally speaking. And I mean, especially when you consider this record in the context of Blur's career, like it is, it's doubly striking. And it's no real surprise that, to a certain extent, it fell on deaf ears somewhat, because there's little about it that has much to offer if you were getting on board with Blur from records like Park Life or The Great Escape, which most people were. And that brings us to Gorillaz, which incidentally is a project that was kind of brewing and having it start while Blur was still active. In fact, I think I read an interview with Damon Albarn where he said that technically the first Gorillaz song that he worked on with his creative partner, Jamie Hewlett, was actually On Your Own, which is a song on Blur's self-titled record. So they formed in 98. They were working on the kind of conceptual ideas of what Gorillaz would come to be. They put out the first Gorillaz album in 2001 while Blur was still active, incidentally, before Blur put out their last album pre-hiatus, Think Tank, in 2003. And then essentially Albarn would dedicate himself to Gorillaz more or less indefinitely, not counting the Blur comeback album in 2015, which isn't very good in my opinion, sadly. But yeah, anyway, Gorillaz became the main focus of Albarn's creative instincts and creative drive, and was reinforced by the fact that relatively quickly, Gorillaz were an incredibly commercially successful prospect. And I actually remember hearing Gorillaz, like I was familiar with Gorillaz before I was familiar with Blur as a kid, despite the fact that my dad liked Blur more and had their albums. I still remember being very young. It must have been around the time the song came out, when I was 4 or 5 years old, and hearing the single from their self-titled record, 192000, which is still one of my favorite Gorillaz songs. And it's basically, it's not instrumental, but it might as well be. And it's not even the biggest single on that record, which is definitely Clint Eastwood. But I remember being enchanted by the goofiness of the bleepy bloopy synthetic electronic sound that song had, which is why it's so bizarre that I never really clicked with Gorillaz as a prospect. I think Gorillaz are a great example of a band that excel in individual moments and have a lot of great songs. But I've, for whatever reason, never fully been able to buy into the prospect of Gorillaz as an album band. That said, I have a lot of appreciation for Gorillaz, particularly their first 3 records, which I think are, between them have a number of stellar songs. Not to mention their best song, which is not on any of those albums, which is Do Your Thing, which they did with Andre 3000.
Fuck, that I was gonna say that's my favorite release from the band. That's I listen to that as like an EP all the time. It's a perfect fucking song.
Yeah, it is. It is, exactly. And it's kind of emblematic to me because that's my favorite Gorillaz song. It's not on an album, is it? That was just a standalone thing.
No, it was done as a promotional kind of like stunt for, I believe, like a brand of shoes. Like they would do this thing where they got artist collabs together, and they got James Murphy of LCD Sound System, Andre 3000, and Gorillaz to do this, where they have like a little release that's the radio edit of Do You Thing, which is like 4 minutes long, and then the full-length version of Do You Thing, which is a 13-minute long clusterfuck of awesome shit, which is, it's the best thing ever made by my measure, even though I haven't listened to a whole lot of them.
Yeah, and that's the thing about Gorillaz, is that their best moments are more or less, with some exceptions, but they are, they're songs that shouldn't work. Essentially, they're messy, they're musically garish. They tend to rely a lot on these, what I've already mentioned, these kind of synthetic sounds that are not particularly aesthetically pleasant. A lot of the time, their music can sound chintzy, it can sound very kitsch. They have a penchant for collaborations with artists who can be sometimes incredibly fashionable and incredibly powerful, but can also sometimes be just extremely bizarre choices of collaboration. And this record we're going to talk about, Plastic Beach, has a number of those. And they kind of, sometimes they make it work through sheer force of will and through sheer ingenuity and just novelty that this is even a thing that exists. And other times they don't quite meet the mark, but you kind of respect the effort. And Demon Days, which I think is probably still their most well-known record and probably the most heard record that they have, and has most of their most enduring songs on it. That is a record that sticks out for its goofiest, strangest moments. Songs like Feel Good Inc., songs like Dirty Harry, Kids with Guns, Dear. And those are, for the most part, great singles. But Gorillaz are an exhausting act to listen to for the length of a full record a lot of the time. And I don't think that's ever something that they overcome with any of their records. But what I will say is that Plastic Beach, their third album, which came out in March of 2010, is, I think, the best record of theirs from front to back, because it is the one that I think cares the least about appealing to any sense of taste, but also marries that with some of the most reasonably well realized conceptual ideas and flow of any of their records. Like, it is not as ridiculously kitschy and over the top as something like Humans, which is kind of a disaster of a record, but also it is listenable and fun, and each song, even when it doesn't always hang together perfectly as a whole, will give you something to hang on to, whether it's a really great beat or whether it's a really memorable feature. And Plastic Beach, like, I've had a strange relationship with Gorillaz over the years. Like, there was a period where I was just being like deliberately sort of antagonistic about them, and I was like, fuck Gorillaz, stupid band. And I've thankfully kind of come out of that and been like, that's not, just grow up. Maybe the Gorillaz aren't for me, but I don't need to be a dick about it. Like, I actually have a lot more respect now for what they do than I had before, and I fully put front and center the fact that a lot of my limitations with them are just personal. I don't think that a lot of what they do is objectively poor in quality. It just, by its very nature, is swing and miss, swing and hit music. But I will say I had a lot of fun listening to Plastic Beach this week. This is a ridiculous record. I mean, right off the bat, with the whole concept of this, urban decay and climate destruction and this kind of post-apocalyptic landscape, and then introducing that with this goofy, chintzy, fucking Aesop rock, Spirit World Field Guide type beat sound of Welcome to the World of the Plastic Beach, and then getting fucking Snoop Snoop. I can't even say it, man. It's fucking stupid, and I respect the stupidity of it.
I get a lot of mileage out of those garish moments, I think. And I think that the reason that this album has always been the Gorillaz album that I've listened to like the most single songs from, because like I have more of a background with Gorillaz than I do with Blur, just because like I've tried to listen to whole albums and there's just parts of them that I just don't really work for me. And again, it's a lot like you. I just like, they don't do anything poorly by my measure. They just don't really do things that interest me specifically, which is odd because in concept, I feel like Jake Anderson, should like Gorillaz. That just sounds like it's right in my head, but it isn't quite. And I do love some of their previous songs, but the production on this album always interested me the most just because of how far it leaned into that sort of garishness and the sort of concept of the record leaning into the kind of, well, I mean, for lack of a better word, there's a lot of the like percussion on here that sounds plasticky. There's a lot of artificiality on this album, and I think it attempts to marry artificiality with a lot of more organic sounding sounds to sort of blend them together and create something unique that epitomizes their concept. And while I'll definitely say I probably like the album, I like this album a great deal for the record. I probably like it a little bit more than Ryley even, but I still definitely have a ceiling here. And the most frustrating part is that I can't fully articulate why. It's because I guess just the inherent sort of scattershot nature of everything, the revolving door of different artists, the eclectic sounds, that's a draw for a lot of people. But for me, I just need a little bit more focus. I need a bit more cohesion. And there is cohesion thematically. I think that one of the reasons why I find this the most sort of cohesive listen that I've since listened to the self-titled Demon Days, is that this feels like the features on this record, they vary in terms of, well, some of them feature in terms of quality, some of them feature in terms of genre, but they mostly stick to the ideas that this album is going for. They feel like they're all on the same page. And I do appreciate that. Like White Flag, for instance, I think is a pretty solid start,
Yeah.
like more formal start to the album that is like you sort of see a progression of the record of the it starts out as characters sort of and features like they sort of live in denial. They're just
Mm.
kind of enjoying the garbage heap, as it were, and sort of ignoring all of the problems and negative aspects that that might entail. And as the record goes on, you can sort of tell that there's a self-consciousness kind of arising out of it all. And this could, for the record, come across as insanely gimmicky and really preachy. And the best compliment I'll throw at this album is that it doesn't, at least to me anyway.
Mm.
I don't really feel like any of the messaging here is rooted in like just Damon Albarn saying plastic bad at you. It really does feel like he's getting at a certain emotionality of like being connected to the earth and sort of like appreciating that from a more like genuinely emotional perspective. And conceptual shit aside, which I respect from this record, I do also just think that this has some really great stretches of songs. Like again, that sort of opening of like White Flag, I think is great. I know a particularly beloved track on here is Rhinestone Eyes, and I'm going to use this song as a bit of to voice a sort of limitation with what I have as Gorillaz overall, and that I do not dislike Damon Albarn's vocal presence, especially as 2D. I really just wish he would stop using the exact same distortion effect on his vocals for every single song he is 2D on, though. Like, from the beginning of their career to their most recent album, he does this on like every song. And I'm like, could you please vary it up just a tiny
It's
little itty bitty?
It's kind of like how Julian Casablancas uses that kind of like talk box effect so much. And it's kind of aesthetically, fitting at some point. Like it works really well on Is This It, Room on Fire. But after a certain point, when you get onto their records later on, and to his credit, he's used it less and less in recent years, but it kind of does start to feel as though it's hindering and kind of taking away some of the three-dimensionality from some of the performances. I will say Rhinestone Eyes is a song I like. I just don't quite like the way that Damon sings it. I don't feel that his singing is well fitted to the song.
Yeah.
But hey, I appreciate it. I think the record, the first half of this record, I do, for the most part, really, really, really like, especially in some of the weirder moments. Like I see that songs like White Flag and Superfast Jellyfish have lower ratings, relatively speaking. And I'm like, I really dig those songs. Like Superfast Jellyfish, especially, like it has two very, very Ryley core features on it. One being De La Soul, who of course were on Feel Good Inc. And they're extremely well fitted to this. This is a very De La Soul type beat song to me. And it just, if anyone who's been watching for a while knows that I love De La Soul, one of my favorite hip hop groups of all time. So it's always a pleasure when they turn up. And Gruff Rhys, who is the frontman of another band that I've loved ever since I was a teenager, Super Furry Animals, is super well fitted for this song as well. Stylo, I really dig too. Definitely my preferred of the two Mos Def features on this record. But I'll get to the other one shortly. Empire Ants is well loved for good reason.
On this album, if you ask me, that beat drop is immaculate. This is the best part of the bright, shining garishness of Gorillaz production. I'm like bought and sold on this song, Gorillaz fans. So worry not. I think this one's terrific.
Yeah, it's my favorite song on the record as well. Glitter Freeze is an interesting choice of collaboration here. So really, really cool and very Gorillaz-esque to bring on Marquis Smith of The Fall. I do feel that this is an underwhelming result for such a collaboration. He's somewhat underused, and the song is it has this synthesizer like musical motif that I feel is a little bit rote and just doesn't really go anywhere interesting. And that can be a lot of
like I like it, but it just sort of like it really thuddingly hits you with it over and over and over again, and there's not a lot of sonic progression with it, so I definitely sympathize with you there.
That can be actually one of my limitations with a lot of Gorillaz deep cuts in general, is that sometimes they can feel a little bit too musically one note or dull after a certain point. And that's just a personal preference thing. I'm not out here saying, you know, like the Gorillaz aren't sophisticated. The Gorillaz aren't sophisticated enough for me. I just sometimes their songs can feel a little bit like, you know, okay, where I get it. Some Kind of Nature is a song I'm weirdly conflicted on, because there's some aspects of it musically that I really like, and I just think that getting Lou Reed on this to do, you know, in that just pre-Lulu era where he was still like doing, like he just like is making no effort to be really all that musical at all.
But
It's
yet I love the way his voice sounds. Maybe it's just because I've become such a big Velvet Underground fan, but I really do love Lou Reed on this song.
yeah, he's a I'm glad he's there, to be honest, even if I don't love the song
Yes.
overall. On Melancholy Hill is a song that was almost ruined for me by the fact that I used to work in a supermarket with a very limited number of songs on rotation, and this was one of them. And so after a while, I was just classically conditioned to hate this song. Even though it's a very good and beautiful song with a lovely synthesizer melody and a really nice tender vocal performance from Damon. Uh, you know, I know hot takes from me. It's a beautiful song. It's not my favorite thing in the world like it is for some people, but I have warmed on it. So yeah, I won't be a dick about On Melancholy Hill like I have in the past. It's a nice song.
I certainly like the back half of this record, but I also do kind of undeniably come down on it being inferior to the front half just because it sort of has littler moments that kind of break that up. I like Glitter Freeze, even though I do have issues with it, and I do really like Some Kind of Nature, even though I almost have the same issue with it. I almost have more problems with the production than I do Lou Reed on here. But it's really kind of the 1-2 punch of Broken and Sweepstakes that kind of halt the record for me, just because Broken is like the most garish sounding thing on here, and like I respect it from a distance, but I also don't really love listening to it. And then Sweepstakes is just like I can barely call this song mediocre. It's just kind of like what are you doing on here, man? Like what's happening?
Sweepstakes.
Like,
So
okay.
the funny thing is, I actually quite like Broken. I think it's one of my favorite things on the record. It is all of the ways you've described it. It has this like very minor key sort of like descending melodic thing that can feel kind of overly gloomy to a certain extent, but I actually quite like it. I've had that broken like refrain sort of stuck in my head off and on throughout the week. And so I appreciate that song. Sweepstakes, however, I kind of hate this song.
Yeah.
I just it's so long and it's so just confusing musically. And I get what it's going for conceptually. I get like the whole relevance of it. Like not only is this a record about kind of, you know, the saturation of just trash and the rampant like consumerism of, you know, the world as Albarn sees it, and this is definitely a song that speaks to that in a very direct and kind of tongue-in-cheek way. It just isn't very musically good, I don't think, unfortunately. And the rest of the record is kind of, it's all right. It's decent. I like To Binge, which is the second song with Little Dragon on it, Yukimi Nagano. I think that's a pretty decent song. The title track, I think, which features two members of The Clash, incidentally, and just completely doesn't use them in any meaningful way.
I was gonna say I didn't know that they were there.
Yeah.
Straight up.
So that's what are you gonna do? It's just not a very interesting song. Neither is Cloud of Unknowing either, and Pirate Jet is a fine ending, but a little underwhelming. I do feel this is a record that keeps basically all of its best ideas within the first half. And again, it is that run from White Flag through to Empire Ants, essentially, that I am really just on board the most with this record. But I do think that this is the best Gorillaz record because it is the one that finds a sensible and logical and coherent way to marry the gearish, again, plasticky and sort of artificialized sounds that this band uses with a concept that makes them make sense and gives them a purpose, essentially, and therefore makes it easier for me to appreciate what the record is trying to do above and beyond simply enjoying the sound of it, which again, I do enjoy the sound of about half of it, maybe slightly more than that. It probably doesn't have highs as good as the best songs on Demon Days. I will say that much, actually. That's a record that I feel like if I go back to that, it might even continue to grow on me some more. Even if I do feel like that record is quite overlong and at points a little bit less remarkable than its highest points. But still, Plastic Beach, I think, is a solid record. It definitely showcases the strength of Gorillaz in ways that I think will help you to decide essentially whether or not this band is going to be for you if you haven't already made up your mind. Gorillaz are a band that seem to have a huge appeal to Gen Z and to people who are even younger than us, who essentially grew up in experiencing, like, with songs like Feel Good Inc. and even on Melancholy Hill, kind of as established classics when they were getting into music. And I think a lot of what Gorillaz represent, the kind of futuristic concept that they are, the aesthetics that they ride with, the kind of, you know, super saturated colors and wild ideas and just relentless hip hop inspired collaborative spirit is definitely going to be something that has endeared them a lot to the people. One, just as an aside, I find it interesting that like a record like Humans, for instance, which came out in 2017, is like just widely derided as a complete catastrophe. And I'm like, yeah, it's a bad album, but like it's not like a million miles worse to me than a lot of their other records.
I got
It's just
the impression
down.
that would be my opinion if I ever listened to Humans, but I didn't really ever get the incentive to, just because, I mean, why would I listen to the worst album from a band that I don't even particularly get along with? And hey, look, if you're a bigger fan of Gorillaz than Ryley or myself, I completely sympathize with you, just because this is a very colorful, creative, and interesting band. And for what it's worth, I really like the run of Plastic Beach through Pirate Jet, particularly Cloud of Unknowing, which I saw instantly and was just like, fucking The Glowing Man? What? I was like, that's an interesting choice. But I do like this and the sonic palette that it draws from, and I do, if anything, I'm glad I did this undertaking, because I have a newfound appreciation for both of these bands in a way that I didn't before. And I know that's like, oh, I didn't listen to a whole lot of music from them before, so obviously, but this is in ways that I didn't expect to appreciate either of them, and it's a way that shows how multifaceted these bands are. And I'm looking at like the rim page for Plastic Beach, for example, and like you look at that little rating trend graph. Look at how big of a climb that is over the years. Like, my God, that goes from like, just, it's like a really solid slant upwards. So I completely understand if this is a particularly beloved record to you. That said, I think it's also so idiosyncratic that it just threatens to hold people like Ryley and myself at a bit of a distance. And yeah, go listen to Do You Thing. I know it's not on streaming, but download that. And
look, I'm always going to be grateful that Gorillaz exist, more so than I ever have been before, because it is super cool to have not only a band that are doing things that at times can sound just incredibly kitschy and uncool and having success in that lane, but also introducing a new generation to artists like De La Soul, to artists like Gruff Rhys, Marquis Smith, and even on more recent records like that amazing song they did with Peter Hook on Song Machine, which is one of my absolute favorite Gorillaz songs. Like, they're still doing that. Spirit of collaboration has gone from being like a cool aspect of Gorillaz to being like the driving force of Gorillaz' creative identity is collaboration. And I actually think that there is a humbleness to that on Damon Albarn and Jamie Hewlett's part, that idea that like because Gorillaz are kind of to a certain extent, like, of the big sort of popular bands of the last 20 years, one of the least egocentric and one of the least kind of like full of self-importance in a certain sense, because it doesn't matter who is behind the boards. Essentially, this music is all about the characters, the music is all about the concepts, and it's all about the collaborators as well, and they're always front and center. So there is a kind of utopian ideal to Gorillaz, if I want to really intellectualize it. It's just a project that is relentlessly about exploring creativity, essentially, and highlighting the creative strengths of artists, and sometimes pushing those artists into contexts that they would never otherwise be in. Like that Song Machine record, for instance. While I don't love that album, you're not going to hear artists like Robert Smith and Saint Vincent and Slow Tie and Schoolboy Q on a record like that for any other reason other than Gorillaz have roped them in. And so that is for Damon Albarn. And just to kind of holistically bring this whole video back together, for Damon Albarn to have evolved from this hyper self-conscious and self-absorbed tortured genius type of musician that he was in the 90s, this kind of super smart, kind of like socially witty, observational psychologist that he was in the 90s, to just essentially backseating himself to this colorful array of characters and people, and this sense of like restless musical invention, is an amazing arc for any songwriter, for any artist. And the fact that he's been able to make good and resonant music in both of those phases in completely different ways is a testament to why he will go down, if not already, as one of the most, remarkable creative forces in popular music of the last, 30 years. He's earned that mantle for himself, and he is only cementing his reputation more and more by continuing to put himself below the art in a certain sense. And there's something really, really respectable to be said for that.
Yeah, I'm sorry the Gallagher brothers told you to get AIDS.
I maybe like Oasis a little bit more, or at least have a little bit more fondness for Oasis relative to Blur than I used to, and that maybe says something about how my feelings have changed as I grow up. Anyway, let's bring this all together and do our favorite tracks and ratings for each of these two albums, starting with 13. Jake, what are your favorite tracks on 13, our least favorite track, and your rating out of 10?
Well, this, if I'm being perfectly honest, 13 is probably one of my favorite first listens I've had of this year. My three favorite songs on it are Trailer Park, Caramel, and No Distance Left to Run. I do not have a least favorite track here. Nothing really sticks out. I guess I could say Optigan 1, but like it's fucking like whatever. It's at the end. It's disjointed like the rest of this album, so who cares? And I give the album a very strong 8.5 out of 10.
My favorite songs on 13 are Coffee and TV, Caramel, and 1992. I have no idea how I wasn't able to include No Distance Left to Run or Tender in that top three. Amazing highs on this record. There are definitely moments on this record I don't care for as much as others, even if I kind of admire the sort of self-destructive spirit with which they're included. So I will say that my least favorites, collectively, I don't particularly get much out of BLUREMI, Mellow Song, or Optigan 1. They're about equal to me, and I'm going to give the record an 8 out of 10, a solid release, and definitely, it's not definitely my favorite Blur record because Park Life is really close behind it, but it is certainly the one that has resonated the most with me over time, which gives us overall an average of 8.2 for Blur's 13.
On the other side of the spectrum, we have Gorillaz. Plastic Beach. I'm going to say my three favorite tracks are, let's see, White Flag, Empire Ants, and Stylo. Least favorite song on here, most certainly Sweepstakes. And I give the album a 7 out of 10. So, yeah, I guess I'm Team Blur here. Oops.
My three favorite tracks on Plastic Beach are going to be Empire Ants, On Melancholy Hill, and I'm going to say Broken as well. My least favorite on Plastic Beach is definitely Sweepstakes, and I'm going to give Plastic Beach a 6.5 out of 10, which overall gives us an average of 6.7 for Gorillaz Plastic Beach. Let us know at home what you think of either of these records. Are you Team Blur? Are you Team Gorillaz? Or are you Team Rocket? I'm just kidding. I don't know why I said that.
Trouble.
And make it double. Let us know at home what you think of these records and which your favorite Blur and Gorillaz records are respectively, what you like about these records, maybe if you are at a distance from either of these records to some extent, let us know in the comments below. We want to hear from you. If you're listening to this episode on Apple or on Spotify, you can head on over to the YouTube link in the description and leave us a comment there. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel if you have not already, of course. If you want to go above and beyond and support us even more, you can hit the join button for just $1 a month. You can support us directly, become one of our Jams and Tea family members, and be able to make us listen to essentially whatever you want, basically, and we'll give you feedback on our thoughts. And also you get your name featured in the title call of every video on the channel as well. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Skittles, taste the rainbow.